In 1938, a group of American engineers drilled into the Saudi desert and hit something so large they didn't believe their own instruments. They recalibrated. They drilled again. Same result. What sat beneath that sand was the single largest reservoir of oil ever found on Earth, and the men standing above it had no real idea what they had just done to the world. Fast forward to today. One city, Riyadh, sits at the center of an economy that controls more oil wealth than any other nation on the planet. Saudi Aramco, the company that pumps that oil, is worth more than Apple, Microsoft, and Google combined. The country earns roughly $1 billion a day just from oil exports. $1 billion a day. Not revenue, not sales. $1 billion flowing into one economy every single day. And yet, here is the part nobody talks about. The people running Riyadh know this cannot last. They're the first ones to say it. They have built entire government ministries around the assumption that their greatest asset is slowly becoming obsolete. So what exactly is happening in Riyadh right now? Why does it matter so much to so many people who have never set foot in Saudi Arabia? And what does it mean when the richest oil state on Earth starts quietly betting against oil? That is what this is about. To understand Riyadh, you need to understand the thing underneath it, the Ghawar oil field. It runs roughly 280 kilometers through the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. For decades, Ghawar produced more oil by itself than most countries produce in total. At its peak, Ghawar was pumping around 5 million barrels a day. That is not a field, that is a geological accident of almost absurd proportions. Saudi Arabia sits on roughly 17% of the world's proven oil reserves. The second largest holder, Venezuela, sits on about 15%. But here is the critical difference. Saudi oil is cheap to extract, extraordinarily cheap. While the global average cost to produce a barrel of oil hovers around $23, Saudi Arabia can produce it for somewhere between $2 to $4 per barrel. $2 to $4, and they sell it for $70, $80, sometimes over $100 a barrel. That gap, that yawning, almost obscene gap between cost and price is the engine of the entire Saudi economy. It is the reason Riyadh exists as it does. It is the reason the skyline keeps rising. It is the reason there is no income tax in Saudi Arabia. The oil pays for everything. But that arrangement has a hidden architecture, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Saudi Arabia does not sell oil like a business. It sells oil like a government. This is the part that most people miss. Aramco is technically a company. It went public in 2019, listed on the Riyadh Stock Exchange, became the most valuable IPO in history at the time. But the Saudi government owns roughly 98% of it, which means Aramco is less a corporation and more a sovereign wealth machine wearing a corporate suit. When Aramco earns money, the Saudi state earns money. The government then distributes that money in the form of subsidies, salaries, infrastructure, and welfare programs that have kept the population comfortable and politically stable for generations. This is called a rentier state, a government that does not need to tax its people because the resource does the taxing for them. And in theory, it sounds like a dream. In practice, it creates an economy that is catastrophically fragile. Here is why. Saudi Arabia needs oil to trade at a certain price just to balance its own national budget. That price, economists call it the fiscal break-even, has been estimated at somewhere around $70 to $80 per barrel in recent years. Some estimates put it higher. Below that price, Saudi Arabia runs a deficit. It starts spending its reserves. The generous welfare state starts to creak. And oil prices are not stable. They never have been. In 2016, prices crashed into the 20s. In 2020, during COVID, oil briefly went negative. You could not give it away.
Every time that happens, Riyadh feels it immediately, not as an abstract economic data point, as a crisis. This is where Mohammed bin Salman enters the story. In 2016, MBS, as he is universally known, unveiled a document called Vision 2030. At the time, he was 30 years old and had been Deputy Crown Prince for barely a year. The plan was ambitious to the point of appearing delusional. Saudi Arabia, he said, would reduce its dependence on oil. It would build a new city from scratch in the desert, a futuristic megacity called Neom. It would develop tourism, entertainment, technology, manufacturing. It would create a sovereign wealth fund, the Public Investment Fund, that would invest globally so that Saudi Arabia would eventually live off the returns of its investments rather than the extraction of its ground. The international press largely raised an eyebrow. Build a tech economy in the desert, in a country with no tradition of startup culture, limited women in the workforce at that point, and an education system that for decades prioritized religious studies over engineering? Sure. But something interesting happened. Some of it started working. Women entered the workforce at dramatically higher rates. Entertainment venues opened. Foreign investment came in. The PIF grew. As of early 2025, it manages somewhere around $700 billion in assets. It owns a substantial chunk of the golf world through Live Golf. It owns Newcastle United Football Club. Saudi Arabia did not stop selling oil. It actually ramped up production in strategic moments to crush competitors. But it started building a second economy alongside the first one. Whether that second economy can ever actually replace the first one, that's the uncomfortable question sitting in the middle of all of this. Here is where the math gets quietly terrifying. The world is slowly electrifying. Electric vehicle sales are accelerating. Renewable energy capacity is expanding faster than almost any projection predicted 5 years ago. Some analysts believe global oil demand could peak sometime in the 2030s. Saudi Arabia knows this. Vision 2030 is, at its core, an act of institutional panic expressed in the language of optimism. The math works like this. Saudi Arabia currently needs roughly $70 to $80 per barrel to fund the government. The PIF needs to roughly double in size to generate enough investment returns to start replacing oil revenues. Neom, the flagship desert megacity, has a price tag that has been estimated at anywhere between $500 billion and over $1 trillion. It is currently behind schedule. The X-Infinite straight line city at its center, called The Line, has had its ambitions scaled back dramatically. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia's population is young and growing. Around 60% of the population is under 35. Millions of young Saudis will need jobs over the next 2 decades, jobs that don't currently exist in the non-oil sector. Creating those jobs requires investment. That investment requires oil revenue. Oil revenue requires high oil prices. High oil prices require OPEC discipline. OPEC discipline requires convincing Russia, Iraq, the UAE, and a dozen other states with their own competing interests to hold the line. It's a tightrope stretched over a very long drop. And then there's the global dimension, which is where this gets truly strange. Saudi Arabia is simultaneously one of the most important partners of the United States and one of the most important financiers of the global energy transition it is trying to slow down. It funds fossil fuel advocacy while also investing in clean energy. It sells oil to China while maintaining security arrangements with Washington. It is playing every side of a board that does not have a fixed geometry. So here is where we actually are. Riyadh is the center of a $1 trillion oil economy that its own leaders are quietly trying to dismantle and replace before the rest of the world dismantles it for them. They're doing this while simultaneously maximizing oil revenues in the short term, investing those revenues in a parallel economy, and maintaining the social contract that keeps a young, growing population from becoming unrestless. The Ghawar field is still pumping. Aramco is still the most profitable company on earth by almost any measure. The skyline of Riyadh is still rising. But there's a version of the next 30 years in which Saudi Arabia successfully transforms, a Gulf state that runs on sovereign wealth and tourism and technology, the way Dubai partially managed it. And there's another version in which the transition stalls. Oil demand drops faster than the new economy can absorb the shock, and the fiscal math simply stops working. Nobody knows which version is coming, including the people in Riyadh. What is certain is this: the next chapter of the global energy story is not being written in Washington, Brussels, or Beijing. A significant portion of it is being written